Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Maryland Risk Management Education Podcast. My name is Paul Goeringer. I'm the Extension Legal Specialist here in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics, and I thank you for joining us today for this latest episode of the podcast. Today, I wanted to kind of give an update on a story and a court case I had covered earlier when it was before the circuit court and look at what happened on appeal with the Baltimore City food truck ordinance, although it's not really one of the typical areas I delve into in the podcast. It's worth looking at because it does impact, a sector of food production and how food is distributed to people. So if we look at over the past few years, we've had this revolution in the food industry with the rising popularity of food trucks. Although many may love to get their daily lunches from food trucks, these vehicles have raised concerns among many brick and mortar restaurant owners, as you could, guess. They're concerned that these things could drive them out of business. Baltimore City imposed restrictions on food trucks, limiting them from operating within 300 feet of any retail business establishment primarily engaged in selling the same type of food product or other merchandise or services as the retail establishment. Food truck operators challenged this law in circuit court, and the ordinance was found unconstitutional for vagueness issues by the circuit court. The city appealed, and the Maryland Court of Special Appeals recently ruled that the ordinance is not illegal, reversing the circuit court. The Maryland Court of Appeals has recently agreed to hear the case on appeal yet again, so we're not sure where this case is going to end up at in the very end, but at least for right now, we know that it's going to end up right about here. So let's talk a little bit about the challenge brought by the food truck operators. The food truck operators challenged the 300-foot restrictions based on violation of Maryland's Declaration of Rights, claiming the restrictions violated their rights to due process and equal protection under the law. So we have a general sense, and I'm going to put in a link to the previous court decision in the bottom and the most recent one, so you can get a general sense of some of the claims being filed. I don't want to go into them here, and I've done another podcast episode on this as well that I'll link in the show notes as well. Looking at the Maryland Court of Special Appeals decision, first, the court rejects claims from the mayor and city council that the challenge by the food truck operators was not ripe for judicial review. Ripeness is a doctrine like standing that I've discussed before, highlighting the power of courts to only hear cases with an injured party where there's actually a case, not something in theory that the city council and mayor are claiming here. Ripeness prevents courts from hearing cases in a vacuum without an actual dispute. In this case, the mayor and city council argued that the ordinance had never been enforced against the food truck operators, and any claim that the ordinance was unconstitutional was not right. The court disagreed with this argument, highlighting that the facts in the case showed the city would not enforce the 300-foot rule, and because the city would never enforce the 300-foot rule, it would never allow a food truck operator to challenge the law based on what the city was arguing on ripeness. The court found that because the ordinance impacted the food truck owners' business interests and prevent potential rights under the state constitution, the claims were ripe for review in this case. The court then goes on to find that the 300-foot ordinance is a valid constitutional exercise of the city's police power. The food truck operators tried to argue that the ordinance is anti-competitive and economic favoritism, but could cite no cases where laws have been struck down based on these arguments. The court agreed with the circuit court that the ordinance was not unconstitutional per se. Moving on to the next claims, next the court turned to the proper level of scrutiny to apply to the ordinance. Claims involving fundamental rights such as race, religion, or national origin require the court to use a strict scrutiny test. In cases such as this, which do not involve a fundamental right, the court uses a rational basis test. The ordinance must have a legitimate interest, and the ordinance means and goals must rationally connect to comply with the rational basis test. The court disagreed with the circuit court that the court needed to use some sort of heightened level of scrutiny in reviewing the ordinance. The court disagreed with the cases cited by the food truck operators because they didn't show that the ordinance would fail the rational basis test. In one case, a county ordinance required tow truck drivers to reside in the county to obtain a license to operate in that county. The court highlighted that the 300-foot rule did nothing to force food truck operators to be residents of Baltimore City to operate. All it did was set restrictions on where they could operate within the city. The second case highlighted involved a statute preventing retired judges from practicing law for profit. The 300-foot ordinance did not do anything to prevent food truck operators from being vendors in Baltimore City to make it similar to this case cited by the food truck operators. The court found that there was no reason to see that they were being limited in their ability to practice their trade. They still had the ability to practice their trade. The 300-foot ordinance to the court was rationally related to a legitimate government purpose. The ordinance addressed issues that can arise when food truck operators set up within a block or 300 feet of a traditional restaurant. The court or the city had presented testimony to show what could happen if a food truck drives traditional restaurants out of business. This was enough to demonstrate the rational relationship between the law and what was being regulated. Finally, the court disagreed with the circuit court that the ordinance was void for vagueness. The food truck operators had never argued vagueness in their initial complaint and had never really brought it up in court. The circuit court appeared to pick it up on arguments that the food truck operators made in closing arguments. The court invalidated the 300-foot ordinance on claims that the food truck operators had never really raised initially. So the court reverses this void for vagueness decision by the circuit court. So what does this mean? Baltimore City wins on this round, but what does this mean? This decision highlights that local jurisdictions do have these greater leeway than we initially thought when trying to limit where food truck operators can operate within the state. Food trucks may have become popular in some areas, but traditional brick and mortar restaurants cannot quickly move around to set up in these popular areas. They're fixed to where they set up. In this case, testimony from community development experts on the impact of closed restaurants and closed businesses showed how this can hamper attempts by the city to revitalize neighborhoods. If people see closed businesses, it may stop them from wanting to operate their own business in the area. It may also stop them from wanting to move into the area and can cause further issues with revitalization. This decision, as I've said before, is not the last word. The Court of Appeals has agreed to hear an appeal by the food truck owners. We will have to wait until sometime in 2020 to see what the final outcome of this case is. Thank you for listening today. If you enjoy what you've heard today, please let me know other things I should be talking about on this podcast. You can tweet me at aglawpaul, or you can email me at lgoering@umd.edu. Thank you again for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.